Hey there folks, the number one soft play fan from the Infinite Jukebox here with another album review, and today I wanted to talk about the new soft play record, Heavy Jelly. It can be a very difficult thing for a band to sort of maintain their footing while also going through a name change. After all, the one thing a person may very well remember after walking away from a band or artist's music is their name, and you could even make the argument that there are some artists whose name is bigger than their music. Some artists are more known for their impact than what they actually sound like, and even then, the question of how much impact a name has on a band remains a pretty valid question to ask. Would the Quarrymen be as iconic as they are today if they had not become the Beatles? Would Mookie Blaylock be as iconic as they are today if they had not become Pearl Jam? So on and so forth. However, it remained entirely unsurprising when two white guys from England decided that maybe the band name Slaves was not a great choice. In 2022, the UK garage punk rock duo Slaves decided to change their name to something that was significantly less questionable, Soft Play, and now here we are in 2024 with their first album under this new and definitely improved name. Name change aside, however, Heavy Jelly sees the band's first album in 6 entire years doing what they're known for, a sort of loose and garagey duo-based punk sound. However, their first release under their new soft play name, it feels lacking a touch in quite a few areas. From an instrumental standpoint alone, Heavy Jelly feels fairly uninteresting overall. I mean, the idea of having nothing but guitar, drums, and vocals is a wonderful setup for what could have potentially been one of the most unfiltered, punk-oriented records of the year so far, but the end result feels more in line with completely average punk sounds and kind of just stripping back any bass and absorbing minimalism in a way that ultimately results in the record feeling kind of lacking in terms of dynamics. I mean, Black Country New Road this is not, of course, but at the same time it really does feel like from an instrumental standpoint a lot of Heavy Jelly is just very normal or average garage punk being stripped back to its core elements, and while that can work for some bands, it just doesn't feel like it really works for soft play here. I mean, Isaac Holman and Laurie Vincent are not bad musicians by any means, they are very competent musicians, and it does genuinely feel like they could have turned this into an impressive album musically, but it just feels like the two have so many missed opportunities that arise at scattered points throughout the record with the two-person dynamic at play here, something that could easily be said about other soft play records as well. And as a whole, I just feel like there aren't really any moments where either Holman or even Vincent really shine that much from a performance standpoint. There aren't any moments throughout Heavy Jelly where Holman really goes all out with his drum work, or where Vincent just really goes insane and kills it with some really intense and really impressive raw guitar work. There's nothing that feels all that really notable here in terms of just pure style and instrumentation, and that's kind of a shame because it's in this way that Heavy Jelly feels oddly restrained despite sonically being a raw album in the most literal sense that an album can be raw. It really does feel like a sonically well-made listening experience for those who appreciate the more garagey side of things, but even in some of the most distorted moments, such as the simplistic The Mushroom and the Swan and John Wick, it kind of feels as if soft play just used these singular melodies and progressions as a crutch to repeat throughout a song, rather than developing those songs in any particular way. I'm not necessarily saying I was expecting some amazing theatrics from this record or anything like that, but it really would have been nice to see the two just amp things up, do a really impressive passage of more noise-oriented guitar work instead of just repeating the same few chords over the course of a 2-minute song. It kind of feels like they're taking the ideas that a lot of classic first-wave garagey punk bands took of doing a few chords and repeating that throughout the song, but not incorporating any of the excellent songwriting and hooks that made a lot of those bands so memorable in the first place. This album has all of the makings of a powerful garagey kind of record, but unfortunately it just feels like the album doesn't really do enough from song to song to make any of it stand out as particularly memorable, and that's a shame because because there are some light influences that go in new directions for the band that are interesting at first, but simply aren't developed enough. Most notably, there are some kind of light nu metal influences to be found throughout Heavy Jelly, though emphasis should really be put on light there, and this can mainly be heard via tracks like the rigid bounce on Act Violently, or the time signature changes on Worms on Tarmac, or the riffs off of cuts like Mirror Muscles, etc., etc. And once again, it feels like these nu metal factors aren't really taken into a direction where they earnestly elevate the record in any particular way. I mean, people who are looking for those nu metal influences here probably won't be impressed with how limited their incorporation is, and people who hate nu metal will probably be slightly turned off by this album due to the fact that these still are at least semi-present throughout. It definitely doesn't help that many of these ideas are in singular songs, isolated incidents, if you will, and a lot of the times they are repeated ad nauseum until the listener kind of gets sick of them, which is a pretty impressive achievement when you consider most of the songs here are like a minute and a half, a couple of minutes for the most part. That's the average song length on this record, and it just feels like songs are just often underdeveloped with one singular nu metal influenced progression before sticking with that for the entire rest of the song and ultimately rejecting the more creative side of the subgenre that made some of the best nu metal bands what they eventually became. And it's just kind of a shame to see an interesting creative direction not really be taken into a huge amount of account in terms of really pushing the creative boundaries of Soft Play as a project. While it is impossible to say whether the incorporation of these influences was just a minor experiment on part of the duo, or something that was meant to be a sort of sonic rebranding, a new avenue for them to go down at the same time as they did a literal rebranding with their name, there isn't much point in having said discussion when the ultimate results of said new direction here leave quite a bit to be desired regarding having something new to say creatively. I think that's actually one of my biggest issues with Heavy Jelly as a record. It doesn't really do anything especially spectacular, yet at the same time, it just feels a bit forced for its own good. I wouldn't necessarily call it arrogance, but it does have a lot of confidence in nothing at times, and the especially angsty cuts feel lacking in particular, with the album opening track, All Things, opening the record up with the line, "I'm the nicest dickhead you've ever met." It kind of feels like that's a fairly apt depiction of the kind of overly smarmy edge that the general record tends to have. Like, oh my god, he said dickhead, and that's a swear word, and then he called himself a dickhead, so he's self-loathing. It just all feels like it's a bit over the top and comical, which is the intent at a lot of points in this record, but at the same time it feels hard to appreciate some of the more tongue-in-cheek moments when it's done in such an obnoxious and at times repetitious way. Similar things could be said about the track working title's extremely predictable chorus of champagne lifestyle, lemonade money, everyone's laughing, but it's not funny, or again the aforementioned extremely repetitious and one-note instrumentals. And while the track Punk's Dead is a fairly funny novelty track based on real people that were weirdly angry of the band changing their name, referring to them as sellouts for not calling themselves slaves anymore for some reason, I don't really think that's much more than just the only moment on this record where the style of, again, sort of self-aware meta-humor that Heavy Jelly is going for really manages to succeed. And even then, that's not saying much because I don't particularly love that track. I just think it's mildly funny. For the most part, Heavy Jelly, it just feels like a record that tries its absolute hardest to be raw and uncompromising, while also refusing to embrace a more unhinged side that this record could have done some great stuff with. I don't necessarily feel like this record is that much different from previous Soft Play albums in the grand scheme of things, but I do think it differs in one way, and that's in the way that this record feels more confident than the band has ever put out before, and I think that's great in concept. But when the final sounds of the record don't really warrant that confidence, I think it all just kind of comes across as maybe a bit overly self-assured. Soft Play's name change may have done the band some good in terms of the duo just simply picking a less questionable name, but it certainly hasn't improved their music a ton, and while there isn't anything on Heavy Jelly that is offensively bad, there isn't much to note either. I mean, the instrumentals are kind of cyclical, and you could really kind of just filter them out into different songs without really feeling that much of a difference. All of it just kind of feels a lot of one note qualities, a lot of very singular qualities in a bad way. A lot of it just comes across as repetitious, and I feel like a lot of this record just ends up not going anywhere. Any of the more initially intriguing influences are not developed in any way that has enough of an impact to really be felt on the record for the most part at large, and the overall scrappy feeling that Heavy Jelly ends up going for just feels kind of artificial a lot of times. This is not the worst punk album of the year by any means, but it certainly is not the outstanding return that Soft Play could have delivered as their first outing under their new, seemingly permanent name. That being said, on the previously mentioned Punk's Dead, the whole, Johnny Rotten is turning in his bed, I was gonna say grave, but the fucker's not dead line. Alright, I'll admit that one got a light chortle out of me, but other than that, this record's just, I guess it's just not for me. I'm going to give this record 2.5 stars out of 5. With that being said, that is the end of this album review. Thank you for watching the Infinite Jukebox, and I'll see you in the next one.